Alright, so the first question was, well, what does it mean to have a belief system? And that's a very complicated problem, and I think it's a subset of the question of being. Maybe you can break the question of being into two domains, which we've done in this class, and you could say, well, you can assess being from the perspective of what exists, and then you can assess being from the perspective of how you ought to act. So it's like you walk into a room and you can describe the furniture, or you can determine how you're going to conduct yourself in the room. Maybe it's the difference between a play and the stage setting for a play. Now, the modernist perspective, roughly speaking, is that the fundamental reality is to be found in the description of the furniture, so to speak, in the description of what is. That's the scientific process. And the scientific process seems to involve the stripping off of the subjective from perception and to some degree from action, and the extraction of the commonalities across perception as a means of delineating the nature of reality. Now, obviously that's a very powerful process, and it has many advantages, but exactly what it is that science is doing is not precisely clear. One perspective might be is that we are genuinely discovering the nature of objective reality, and perhaps even the nature of reality itself, but there are some problems with that perspective. One of them being that the scientific process seems to strip the subjective from the phenomenon. It does that technically, right? I mean, you have a hypothesis about what something is, and you have a hypothesis about what something is, and you have a hypothesis about what something is, and we undertake a number of procedures to assess what the fundamental phenomena is, and then we look across our perceptual sets and we extract out the commonalities, and we dispense with everything that is superfluous, everything that's merely subjective. So what you feel about the chair is not relevant to the objective existence of the chair. And so it eradicates subjectivity. And that's a very useful process because it does seem to enable us to grasp reality in a fundamental sense more profoundly, but it leaves the subjective behind, and maybe that's a problem.
It should be working out.
Okay.
I didn't send the projector because they didn't make the noise.
Okay, okay, thank you.
I would have, I just didn't want to.
All right, okay. Appreciate it. So then the issue might be, well, is something irretrievably lost if you dispense with the subjective? And also, how deep a hole do you dig when you dispense with the subjective? And I think that that's intrinsically associated with the problem of the relationship between is and ought, because that's an old philosophical conundrum, I think first put forth by David Hume, who made the claim that no matter how much you know about something from an empirical perspective, you cannot use that as an unerring guide to action in relationship to that empirical object or set of empirical objects. And people, it's a tricky issue, you know, because obviously you can use empirical information to inform your decisions. But the problem is that there's multiple pathways of action that are implied by any set of data. That seems to be the fundamental problem. It's something like that, is that you can't draw a one-to-one specification between the empirical description and what you should do about that. And like maybe an example is, well, you can gather a lot of information about AIDS, and you can gather a lot of information about cancer, and you can gather a lot of information about educational outcomes and economic outcomes and so forth, but it isn't obvious how you then use that empirical information, for example, how to guide policy decisions, because you might say, well, how much money should we spend on education compared to cancer prevention, and how much money should we spend on cancer prevention compared to curing AIDS, and or addressing disease in a third world country. And what happens is that the set of variables that you encounter while trying to make your empirical calculation get to be so massive so rapidly that there doesn't seem to be any logical way of linking them to a behavioral outcome. That's kind of associated with the postmodern conundrum as well, which is, Well, if you have a set of data, and it could be a literary work for that matter, there's a very large number of interpretations that you can derive from that set of data, and there's no simple way of deciding which one is going to be canonical. And so it isn't, I think the reason that you can't derive an ought from an is because you run into something like combinatorial explosion. It's like you have an infinite number of facts at your disposal, roughly speaking, and then another infinite number of ways that you can organize those facts, and that massive array of facts and recategorized facts doesn't tell you what to do in a given situation. And so maybe the question of what to do in a given situation is a different domain of question. And I believe that to be the case. I think it was Stephen Jay Gould who talked about religion and science as two, I think he called them different magisterium, two different fundamental domains and that each had their realm of operation. And one was the description of the objective world, obviously that's on the scientific end, and the other was the realm of ethics. And so you could put religion, mythology, narrative, the humanities, all of that, history even for that matter to some degree into the ethics category. And because I don't see a straightforward way of taking a set of facts and then transforming them into a behavioral compulsion, then I do think that these two things are reasonably regarded as overlapping and intrinsically associated, but technically and philosophically separable.